With that out of the way, we get to our main segment here today on Mastering Dungeons. We will continue our delve into the Daggerheart playtest, the new game from Darrington Press and Critical Role. So we've looked at character creation and we've looked at the sort of base rules. And now we're going to dig into what this playtest packet gives you and how you can move forward playing it using the cards and how the game master plays with this set as well. I want to point out that Tom Dunn, our math wizard, if you will, one of our patrons, looked at the math of the duality dice probability and that the odds of rolling with hope are 54% or 71% with advantage. And then the odds of rolling a critical hit are 8% normally and 16% if you have advantage.
Yeah,
So
and I'm interested to talk about
tickling 20% there.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. And I had if we talk about the Ranger later, I have a thought that goes back to this.
Mm-hmm. So we are going to look at this playtest packet that you can download for free. What does it contain? It contains a 316-page rule book that gives you the entire rule set for the game, including all the classes and heritages and everything you need. For each class, there is a 20-page packet that you can hand to players that includes guide for character creation, a character sheet, a guide for reading the character sheet, a 2-column cradle, I call it, that you can put on each side of the character sheet with arrows pointing to give you help on how to play that character. There's a full equipment guide. There's ancestry cards for all the ancestries, community cards for all the communities, and then ability cards for 10 levels of the 2 different domains for that character class. And then also subclass foundation and subclass mastery cards. So that 20-page packet is for each class. So you hand each player this 20-page packet. There are sheets that you can write your loadout and your vault cards on. And then the DM packet has most of this same information, including the cards for players, as well as a 39-page adventure with a how to teach this game section of that adventure in it, as well as some tokens and some things you can cut out to use at the table to play. So if you download this free playtest packet, you are getting a game and a half right off the bat.
Yeah, and then some.
This is something that you would look at a beginner box set and say, oh, this is cool, but this would be too much for a beginner box set. So
yeah,
that's
maybe
what you're getting.
Yeah, and what I love about it is this represents a very good process to holistically look at your own game, and which is very hard to do. I try to do this a lot in projects, and it's really hard to convince companies to devote this kind of time to turn on your new person brain and look at what you've got and say, what do I need to make the most of this? And that character sheet, what was the name you called it?
The cradle.
The cradle is really smart, right? Which is this one piece of paper you can print out and you can hold half of it to a side. And now it's got arrows that line up with your sections of the character sheet to tell you what each of them do. And then move it over to the other side and cover the other half of the character sheet. And what that does is it's a piece of paper you don't need when you've got it. But when you're early on, it's a constant explanation, but without eating up the real estate of the character sheet. That's really brilliant, right? That's really smart. And they have a number of other things like that is really about like, what is it that a person needs to use to grasp this, which is good because then it allows them to have a little more of that complexity, which they clearly want in their game.
Yeah. And using this packet or using the whole playtest bundle, but using this packet, you can make your own beginner set for your players with pre-generated characters, all these handy add-ons, all the cards. You would have to print them and cut them out, but you could do it yourself and run a really interesting session, I would say, of this game. So for your money, which is
Zero.
$0.00, you are getting quite a bit.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. It's really smart. I mean, it's impressive, and it's nice because at the playtest level you already feel cared of, so you're kind of excited to see, well, when this comes out, they will probably have that level of care for it too, and that's great.
For sure. So what we want to do now is dig down into certain cards to walk through the abilities that those cards present and how a class is designed to be played for this game. So we're going to start with the domain cards. The
Mhm.
domain cards have information on them to help you understand how to play, but also become a part of the design of the game in terms of moving cards around and using cards a specific way.
And I want to
So
pull,
Teos,
if I can
yeah,
just pull back a second and just say,
sure.
hold on, you're going to sell me cards? If this were D&D, can you imagine the criticism if D&D 6e came out? Right? I mean, we saw it during 4e,
Yeah.
right? You start giving out cards and people go, what are you doing to my role-playing game? But we don't treat other companies that way usually. So in fact, if anything, they generally get praised for it. So here we have a situation where, cards aren't just like optional. These are really baked into it, right? And you're going to want to buy these cards, which is monetization, if I dare say so. And they're gorgeous art. They're pretty tangible stuff, right? So it's got a gameplay thing, which fourth edition also had that benefit to it. And then you've got these various sort of like a Magic the Gathering or other CCG game card. You're going to have reproducible icons and things like that. So you get to learn them quickly, and you're going to spend them and either tap them or flip them over, or whatever you want to do with it.
Yeah. And when Teos says it's required, it's not required, but it is so much easier to play the game.
Yeah.
The game is designed with the understanding that you will have these cards that you will need to switch out, put from your loadout to your vault and
Yeah.
vice versa. And so you can do that on a piece of scrap paper, right? You can do that on a sheet, but it's so much easier just to say, oh, I'm going to put this into my vault and I get in a certain number of points because I do this. And then, oh, I need to take something out. Well, I
Yeah.
spend a stress to do that, right? It's a mechanical system that is made easier through the use of cards.
Yeah. And it's a little more, if for folks who are familiar with 4E, it's a little more flexible than 4E in terms of what it's, or maybe let's say it's a wider scope of what it's trying to do.
Mhm.
These
Right.
cards can represent not just your powers, but general features, but they have some sort of spend to them generally.
Mhm.
Um, some utility, sort of like the utility powers in 4E did, but it's a little wider than that. How often you may be able to use them and what you may be able to do with them.
Mhm. And we're going to discuss that right now by talking about the domain cards. If you remember from our last show, when you choose a class, you get two domains. So your domains will give you certain abilities that are represented by these cards. And you will have to then make a choice at certain points across the life of your character, what ability from which domain I'm going to choose. I can only choose one of these first level abilities from my domain. So do I choose this one or do I choose that one? And once you make that choice, that other card goes away and you will continue to use this card going forward. Uh, what is
And
on a card? I'm
before just
glad you
more,
asked.
one more just
Oh,
quick
yeah,
thing to
go ahead.
review is that each class has two domains. The domains are shared, but the combination is unique. So Druid is Sage and Arcana, but someone else, probably Wizard has Arcana, maybe Sorcerer has Arcana, I forget. But
Yeah.
you aren't the only one to have one of them. You're the only one that has those two combinations. And so you'll share some powers with other characters at the table potentially.
Mhm. Yeah. And so if you choose all of the powers from one of these domains, the thief or the rogue could have all the darkness cards, and so could the sorcerer have all the darkness cards. So you could
Yeah.
have a sorcerer and a thief or a rogue with the exact same set of power domain abilities, but different things elsewhere from their class that make those mean something else. So what's on a domain card, Teos?
So you have a level that is the maximum level based on your character. So if you're a first level character, you can only choose level 1 domains. It'll tell you what the domain is. So if it's something like that, arcane or whatever, the different types are out there, bone and shadow and things like that. I don't quote me on those names. So that identifies the maximum, the minimum level requirement and what it belongs to. There is a recall cost. So the way it'll work is you're going to have 5 domain cards that you've chosen, and some of them will be in your vault, and then you'll have a number in play based on your level. And you can swap between those cards. They said in the rule book that once you reach level 5, you'll have more cards than you have space in your loadout. Earlier levels, it's not a big deal, but eventually you have to choose which powers do you want. It's a little bit like if in 4th edition, you remember, you reach certain levels and you didn't get a new card, you swapped for a power, and you could choose whether you want to keep a lower level power, higher level. It's a little bit like that. So you eventually are having this this vault, and you can swap from your loadout to your vault during downtime without any issue, or you can mark a stress to do it at any point. So even in the middle of a combat, you could suddenly get that other power that you didn't think you'd need and bring it back in. You just take stress to do so, which is interesting, right? It's that whole answers that problem of what if you want to have that utility power that, you only use every now and then. Well, you can keep that in your vault and pay the stress to pull it out.
Mhm.
What else, Shawn?
Each domain card also has a type. Now, this may not be a big deal right now, but it may be later. So the first type of domain card is called ability. This is the non-magical, the mundane types of powers. So for example, I'm looking at a guardian right now, and one ability is called forceful push. So when you make a melee attack, you can push something and add damage to it. Then there are spell type domain domain cards, I should say. And those will be magical damage and magical consequences of that. And finally, there's a third type called a grimoire. And right now, that is unique only to the codex domain. So if you look at a card for the Guardian, which is more of a fighter type, it says ability. If you look at a card for a sorcerer or a wizard, it says spell. And if you look at the codex domain, it says grimoire. Does it mean anything? Not currently, but we are told that some of these mechanics in the game might apply to only one type of card. So there may be a monster, I'm just guessing, but there may be a monster there that is immune to spell cards or immune to ability cards. So
or
it's just
maybe a
something to keep in
magic
mind.
dead zone might not allow
Yes,
some types, things like that. Yeah.
for sure. So I can see ways that you could make those things, make more of them, and add mechanics to make those different depending on the situation. And the last thing a card will have is an effect. That's what happens when you use the card. So for example, I'm looking at Bare Bones, which is a first level Valor ability. When this card is in your loadout, if you choose not to equip your armor, you have an armor score equal to 3 plus your level. So it gives you the ability to go without armor, which does things like lower your agility, which means you're easier to hit. So different things that you can choose there with those cards.
And we do in this game, it's kind of nice. They put often chapter headings for things that there will be, but aren't there yet. And one of them is called custom domain cards. And so it'll be interesting to see, if they have in mind the idea that you could make your own somehow. It's unclear kind of what that means, but there's a placeholder there in these rules for having that eventually, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, we're one of the reasons we're going through this is because I use Demiplane, and I wasn't sure because I was using the Demiplane interface what a card was
Mm.
and wasn't, because everything just showed up on your character sheet. Nothing was actually labeled cards. Uh, in Demiplane, there was a domain effect thing, but I wasn't sure what that actually meant as I was playing. And the whole idea of a vault versus your loadout, I didn't I didn't understand because there was a small button that said view vault,
Mm.
but it was off to the side and it wasn't highlighted in the main area. So I had no idea what it was. So I had the assumption that the cards you didn't choose when you created your character or leveled were in your vault and that you could switch them in and out, but that doesn't appear to be the case.
Yeah. And just to give a couple of examples, right? So here's the Ranger. You have an ability, Def Maneuvers. You can mark a stress to move anywhere within far range without making an agility roll to get there, right? And it has a 0 refresh. So you can actually pull this from your vault without paying that cost. No, pulling you can, what is it? You can so it basically doesn't get expended, right? I think that's what that
Mhm.
means. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so that's an ability. Then you have a spell, Vicious Entangle. Make a spellcast roll against a target within far range. On a success, roots and vines reach out from the ground and temporarily restrain them, dealing D8 physical damage. On a success, you may also spend a hope to temporarily restrain any enemies very close to your target, right? And that's got a 1 refresh cost. It's level 1 power. So that's an example of a spell where you must make the spellcast roll to succeed. It is really like an attack type spell versus a kind of feature that's always on with this Def Maneuvers, or Nimble, for example, is an ability for the Ranger. While this card is in your loadout, add half of your agility score to your evasion rounded up. So that's just on, right? You're just boosting yourself. It's not even a choice to use it. It's interesting.
Mhm. So so you're shuffling these cards, not literally shuffling, but you're moving them, yeah, during play and as you gain levels. Uh, so when I was playing, my second level sorcerer, we had leveled up. My second level sorcerer had a feature called Channel Raw Power that let me place one of my domain cards from my loadout into my vault, and then I could gain hope equal to the card's level, or enhance a damage dealing spell by dealing extra magic damage equal to twice the level of the card. So I could take one of my first level cards, put it into my vault, and either gain 1 hope or deal 2 extra damage with a spell. But then I wasn't sure how I got it out. And I didn't know, do I do it during downtime, or do the rules that say I could take a stress to pull a card out from my vault, does that apply now? Can I do it right away? Do I need to wait? Right?
Yeah.
All of these questions were sort of looming, and it was a play test. I'm sure my
Yeah.
game master knew the answer or could have found the answer pretty quickly, but it was all sort of confusing to me. Uh, and then I wasn't sure if any of that even applied before I was 5th level because there was nothing in my vault to change with.
I think the answer to all that is yes, but part of
Mhm.
what's tough is, and this Daggerheart specifically uses a lot of these keywords that aren't sort of just normal keywords, like attack roll. Okay, you don't, if you've played an RPG, you get that. But evasion, hope, fear, stress, your knowledge trait, these kinds of various keywords, sometimes it gets really word soup in
Mhm.
these things, in the cards or in other features. And it can be really hard to get the feel of what's happening when there's too much of that, because
Yeah.
it's not yet rote our
Mhm.
understanding of those keywords. And the more and more you get to understand all these things, and they all become background knowledge, it'll be easier. But at least initially, I found even reviewing the classes, sometimes I would think, well, okay, what is this feature doing? Like
Mhm.
both what's the narrative and what is even the gameplay of it, because of these kinds of things, right? Like you said here, this all right, I've got channel raw power. That's just the name. But then my domain card, okay, that's these cards, not my ancestry, heritage stuff. This,
Right.
and then I can make hope equal to the card's level, or this, but I got to put it in the vault, and all those keywords can be a hill to climb, right? That make it a little harder until you've got all these rules down.
Yeah. And even when you get the rules down, what is it? The human brain can only remember 7 things at once, right? Was that the last stat I heard? Uh, I
I
will
can't
never
remember.
remember loadout. If they don't change that word, I will never ever remember it. I will always have to look up what
Yeah,
loadout, what's in play. What is that word? I know vault. Vault I can
yeah.
understand. Vault is it's locked away. Loadout, I'm just lost.
Yeah, I
And
mean it's a
it's
very
not,
it's a video gamey thing, right? Your
yeah,
switch
yeah,
loadouts, right? And, oh, I'm going to
yep.
go in as a tank today, or I'm going to whatever. Yeah, it is, and I think this game is really treading that line between narrative and finicky, mechanically complex. The payoff will be that if you buy into this stuff and you get to where you all understand it, maybe
Mhm.
then all this stuff fades into the background because you gain that expertise and you're having some really awesome fun, and then can do these narrating bits on top of it. I mean, I think those of us who made the most of fourth edition loved it because we did exactly that. All of the gobbledygook that annoyed other people was background stuff we didn't care about and just assumed. And we were there role playing away, having fun, describing our powers with these great, evocative ways, and having a blast. Whereas other folks will say that it's way more evocative to just swing your axe every round, right? And so you,
Mhm.
you end up with that. We'll see how Daggerheart does over time with this approach and how that pays off.
Yeah. And speaking of just swinging your axe, at least at second level, with hope being something I needed to spend to do my really strong powers,
Mm-hmm.
I was often in the position where just hitting things with my staff, now it was a magical bolt flying from my staff, but it was just my weapon attack. That was often the best thing to
Mm-hmm.
do, which felt both bad because I felt like, oh, I can't do these cool things, but also good because it was powerful enough that if I wanted to just hit things with my staff,
Uh-huh.
that was good. That was a viable option. It wasn't so suboptimal that I didn't feel like I was contributing to the action.
Yeah, yeah, no, that is, it is really interesting. That I think it has that concept of at wills trying to
Mhm.
make the general things you do are good, and it dances between the different classes on how it does these things, right? Some characters, like the rogue, you're just attacking, except when you choose to do something to trigger your sneak attack, and except when you choose to make an offhand attack, and except so these
Mhm.
exceptions that you may do sometimes, but often you're taking stress or expending hope to do them. And it's got to be a very interesting design challenge to try to keep these balanced and keep them
Mhm.
compelling. And I think that's, if we had all the time in the world, we could compare all of the classes and really how they
Mhm.
do that. And I think some of them do better than others in their current state at coming off that way as compelling and interesting in terms of the play behind
Right.
them.
Because we haven't really even talked about the things that you can do because of your heritage, because
Mm-hmm.
of your community, and the way there are, what was it, 9, 20 some uh of you. I call it species. I
The
don't remember
ancestry. Yeah.
ancestry. Uh, there were a lot,
Yeah.
and each of those had uh, couple of different powers, and so did the community that you chose could
Yeah.
give
And
you
in
some
general,
powers.
the ancestries are interesting in that they will often say a thing, but then you have one or two abilities, right? So if I look at fairy,
Mhm.
you can take a stress to fly for a number of minutes equal to your level. Once per session, after you are an ally in close range and make an action roll, you can spend 3 hope to re-roll those duality dice and take the new result. So those are kind of your features. But then in the description, it'll sometimes say things that sound like an ability, and it's like, well, am I supposed to do something with that? Like, is that a thing I forget an example of them, but there are a couple that I was reading recently, and it I was like, well, this is the kind of thing you could argue to your DM, that you can just do a thing because of how this is described, but it's not a feature, so I don't know if I'm allowed to do it or not. It was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. All of those things could interact. As a demon, uh, when I rolled with fear, I could mark 2 stress to make it a roll with hope instead,
Yeah.
which can interact in interesting ways with a character that really relies on hope to power things.
Yeah.
And then as an order born, if I what's per short rest, if I described how I was embodying my principle through my action, I could roll a d20 as my hope die instead of a d12. So again, that's pretty powerful
Yeah.
stuff mechanically. Whereas the Slyborn is just you have advantage on rolls where you're negotiating with criminals, detecting lies, or finding a safe place to hide. So those two things to me are quite
Yeah.
a difference in the mechanics there.
Yeah. So I found one of them, halfling. This is similar to what you're saying. Halflings, it says, are naturally attuned to the magnetic fields of the mortal realm, granting them a strong internal compass. That's not a feature, it's just description. They also possess strong senses of hearing and smell, and may be more able to detect those who are familiar to them by the sound of their movements. And it's like, okay, but then their feature is that they give out hope to everybody in the party at the beginning of session. But I'm like, well, what do I can I argue to my DM that my that I get to do this? Or the fungrel, it says that they can enables some to communicate with other fungrels across long distances. So can I do that? Because it's not a feature. It's really interesting, right? And how do you balance that out and make that feel fair, and to where someone isn't saying, well, can we have some criminals in the adventure so I can finally use my feature?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, like Teos said, it would be interesting to go through each of these things and balance them against each other, or look for ways that one might be super
Yeah.
strong if combined with a specific class or specific abilities or spells from a specific class. But we don't
Yeah.
have that time because
No.
we want to talk about the action tracker and what that means for the game. So, when combat occurs, an action tracker is used. Players may go in any order they want, but most actions, if you attack or do something that says as an action, you must put a token on the action tracker to show that you have acted. So, players can go in any order. One
And as
player could
often
take
as they
several
want.
turns,
Yeah.
and as often as they want. They continue until one of these things happens. So the game master does not act until one of these things happen. A player fails on a check they're making, a player rolls with fear, or the game master spends 2 fear that they've collected. They start with 2, and then they can collect fear as players roll with fear. So they can spend 2 fear to interrupt and begin to take actions. There is an optional variant that has been added that says players will have 3 tokens, and they use those across the entire party and then can get another 3. So, in other words, players can only go 3 times before everyone else can catch up
Yeah.
and go 3 times.
And that's an interesting concept, right? Go whenever you want, but 3 times. It points, I think, to the interesting difficulty Daggerheart's having in communicating its initiative system, because like Apocalypse World just says, look, you all make the call, right? Should a certain person go, then the DM tells them to go.
Mhm.
Does it make sense that now is when another person goes? Well, then that's what happens, and someone can step in at any time, and that's just the way it is. And don't sweat the details. It's not about balance; it's about the narrative.
Mhm.
And here we say, well, maybe you should have these 3 tokens so that you go. I think that the narrative thing, what's interesting is, in Apocalypse World, if I want to roll several times, likely the GM or do several things. Likely the GM is going to have a monster just react narratively. And that's
Right.
truly a narrative decision. Here, you may want to go 3 times in a row or however many times in a row, but you'll probably fail one of those rolls or probably roll with fear. And those dual chances of those things happening actually are pretty high, right? Like according to Tom, 54% of the time, so 46% of the time you're rolling fear. And you're going to fail some percentage of the time too.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have either of those things happening quite often. And I shared, in the game we played, we had an encounter where every single roll was either a failure or with fear. And that meant the GM was just going all the time. And that really broke things up and kind of both slogged things up a bit and, interrupted pacing a little too much,
Mm-hmm.
but also meant that the players couldn't just have at it and do all of the things they wanted to do.
Right. And what I found was when we played, even we used different colored action tokens to show who has acted. But we might have had one where the same player went twice, pretty much back to back. So there were two of those tokens on the map. And then somebody else acted, they put their token on. But then the game master, as we'll talk about in a minute, can spend those actions to do
Yeah.
things. So uh, they would take that token off, but they would take the token off of the player that's acted twice. So then the only token that was on there was the player who had only acted once. So it made it like, oh, well, then this player can act again because their token isn't on there. Wait, they went twice. You just happened to
Yeah.
take theirs off. So there's that sort of thing, keeping track of who went. Um, if you're trying to keep some sense of fairness and keeping everyone involved. So it's going to be incumbent on the game master and the other players to sort of police themselves in
Yeah.
terms of making sure everyone gets a chance to act.
Yeah. Because there's no way the DM's going to know which tokens to pull out of the action tracker. And that
Right.
is what's interesting, right? The neat concept that's going on here is players putting these action tokens when they act onto the tracker is creating a currency that the GM can spend when you either fail a roll or roll with fear, or if the GM spends fear and the GM now gets to go, then the GM will spend those actions. They'll take those tokens and use those to activate NPCs. So the more that you have gone, the more tokens that there are to fuel the enemies responding. And that's the kind of clever concept that's going on there, that this narratively can swing pretty widely, possibly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or at least, and if not much has happened on the PC side, then it can't swing very far, right? I might only have one action token there. You fail, well, I can maybe do one thing as GM, and now we got to go back to players because my monsters literally can't go. And that's an interesting concept. It's going to take, I think, for me to play a lot of games. I'm going to play another game pretty soon coming up, but I think it's going to take a good number of sessions for me to get a feel for how this system works in this way.
Yeah. And we see some of this in D&D, even in 5th edition D&D, right? There's legendary actions, there's reactions, there's those things that let the enemy go when they normally wouldn't be able to. And you could make a version of 5e where creatures get to act on certain initiative counts, but also can act when they hit a certain hit point threshold. Bloodied was a thing in 4th edition that sort of mimicked this idea of story-wise, a trigger happens that lets the enemies go, or even lets the player characters go in certain situations. So it's not unheard of in D&D's history, including current D&D, but it's less malleable than what this presents,
Yeah.
which really relies on the game master to decide when it's time to take this step in the story.
And that on that uncertainty piece, it ties, or the monster symmetry piece. Sorry, it's very interesting to think about that and apply it to this, because the GM is bound by these action trackers as fuel for their actions, Whereas the PCs can, in theory, if you're not using the optional variant, can go as often as they want, right? They are generating the currency for the GM to go, but the GM is bound by that. So the GM is really responding to the players, but the players are not responding to the monsters. And so it's an interesting lack of symmetry there.
Yeah. And so that asymmetrical aspect, which we talked about in the earlier segment in our question section, is an aspect of the game that is very much leaned into in this game, as many of the Powered by the Apocalypse games do. We are out of time for this episode, but next time we're going to get into the game master side of things, including what the game master is allowed to do, what they are encouraged to do, and how the monsters of the game can be used in play and in the story. So thank you out there for listening. We do appreciate your support. Your ear holes, we hope, are pleased by what you see, even if your eye holes are not if you watch us on YouTube. But thank you to our Master of Dungeons Patreon supporters. We very much appreciate everything that you do for us. For the Master of Realm supporters, you, fine folks, are listed in our show notes. And our Masters of the Multiverse, they get a shout out right now. So thank you, Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios, Craig Bailey, David Bastianson, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Evil John, Andy Edmonds at nerdronomicon.com, The Mighty Jerd, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Jim Klingler, a.k.a. DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, The Mathematician, Eric Mengi, John Mickey, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Tom Nelson, creator of the Deck of Player Safety, Mike Olson, Mighty Zeus, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Robert Pasley, Vladimir Prunner from Croatia, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Andy Shockney, Krishna Simonse, Jeremy Taluman from the D&D and TV podcast, Trace, Joe Tyler, James Walton, Graham Ward, Javier Waziak, and Chris Webster. Thank you so much for your support. You can become a patron of the show and support our efforts here by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. You make our face holes smile. If you get a chance, you could also review us on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to this podcast. Give us those 5 beautiful stars to let everyone know that you're enjoying the show. You can also subscribe via YouTube so that everyone out there knows what we do. Teos, where can people find your work?
Find me at alphastream.org. From there, you can get to all my stuff, including this week. I'm going to have a video up for the Lore of Neverwinter, where they have a new Spelljammer expansion, and they have some shenanigans and some really cool scenery to inspire anybody who's running a Spelljammer campaign.
Nice. You can find me on all the socials at Shawn Merwin, and you can follow the show on the socials at Mastering D&D. I want to thank Chris Nizak, who hosted me in another Daggerheart show on the Misdirected Mark podcast. So it was great talking about that, and you can check out that show at Misdirected Mark. So Teos, we have gotten through the player side of things, and we're getting now into the nitty-gritty of Daggerheart. So what should we do now?
I'm going to contemplate whether, if everybody plays a ranger and deals stress damage to a monster, making them vulnerable, whether you can just live with always attacking with advantage. All ranger party. Who's with me?
Yep. And I'm going to contemplate breaking the game in some other ways as we go forward, but I'm not going to talk about that now. No, it's a secret. My lips, except for the fact that they're flapping, are sealed.
Are sealed.